And we're live. Hopefully you did not just hear about me being in the fetal position and starving to death. So, good morning, everybody. It's really not that bad. We were talking about why it's great to have hope so people don't end up in that situation. So, I'm very excited to talk again this week with Andra Watkins. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me again. It's always a joy to see you. I love your new glasses, or glasses I have not seen.
So, thank you very much. I appreciate that. These are the backup glasses for when the glasses I normally wear have inexplicably disappeared. And so I have a number of glasses in rotation because I am not enough of a grown-up to be able to keep track of reading glasses. So we want to talk about, first of all, Andra is the author of the For a Time Such as This newsletter on Substack that is absolutely essential daily reading. You also have a live coming up at noon that I am going to be tuning in for. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I have a feeling it's going to be applicable for a shocking number of people who have these folks in their lives.
I have asked a licensed therapist named Anna Hollander-Bird. She lives in Los Angeles, and she works with patients who have survived parental narcissistic abuse. So I have survived that as well. So anyone who has been exposed to narcissist abuse and has gone through therapy feels like living in the United States at the hands of our government right now is just a constant swarm of narcissistic abuse that we're subjected to all the time. And a lot of people who maybe haven't been exposed to that otherwise feel exhausted and demoralized and don't understand that they're actually being abused psychologically. So we're going to talk about what narcissist abuse is, how to recognize it when the government does it to you, and give people some tips and tricks to try to protect themselves from it. So that's at noon Eastern on my Substack.
Sorry, turning my microphone back on now that Fezzik is done having his morning fit. Part of the reason I think that conversation you're going to be having is so important is that we are, as a nation, all the children of a narcissistic abuser. And it's really important to understand how we all react to that and how the people who are underneath them are reacting to that. So thank you for having that conversation. That's at noon, and you should subscribe to her Substack because it is for paid subscribers. So definitely check out For a Time Such as This. And we are here today to talk about anti-Christian bias, the scourge of our country, apparently, because Christians in the United States are the most persecuted people in history. Can you explain to us why many people in our government feel that way and how that is all going to rain down on us through policies that they're putting in place?
So one of the things when I was writing about Project 2025 last year that terrified me was seeing how many times they mentioned the words religion, religious, faith, faith-based groups. They only used the word Christian 6 times that I counted in my word count of the document, but they used religion, religious faith a bunch of times, almost 200 times. And so having some sort of faith-based something was going to be a big part of this new government. Now, they didn't come out and say it was going to be Christian nationalists in Project 2025, but all the subtext and all the coded language they used that I grew up being indoctrinated in very much said that. So one of the things that they've been doing to Christian nationalists for the past 50 years or so is indoctrinating people in the pews to feel persecuted and to see persecution everywhere. So I gave some examples of that in my newsletter 2 days ago from my youth. When I was a child sitting in the Christian nationalist pews, being a good little Christian nationalist kid, my pastor called Christian persecution, which they're calling anti-Christian bias. It's the same thing. It's just a new word for Christian persecution. That we were being persecuted by having prayer taken out of public schools. We were being persecuted by being told that we couldn't put nativity scenes in front of public buildings that were paid for by taxpayer dollars. We were being persecuted by having evolution be taught as science in public schools. We were being persecuted by having Bob Jones University's tax exempt status be revoked by the IRS for not admitting Black people, which is really what started us down this horrible, hideous road that we're on. That was what caused everything that has happened since. So he would preach from the pulpit about all these kinds of things that were persecution that we were supposed to see everywhere. So over the course of 50 years, there have been millions of people who've sat in pews week after week after week and listened to that garbage. And many of them are highly radicalized by it now and see persecution everywhere. So the groups that put together Project 2025 renamed that persecution complex anti-Christian bias, and they are now on a crusade through the government to only have a government of white Christian nationalists who are working in and running the government. First, they used DEI to try to purge people. Now they're going to use "you're not a Christian" to purge people. And so they started at the Secretary of State with Marco Rubio. They moved over. Pam Bondi's done something at the VA, but this will be a government-wide effort, and they won't stop with those two organizations.
And one of the things that they're asking people to do, the VA sent out an email to the entire staff of the VA, which is massive, essentially asking them to report on their fellow members of the VA and report incidents of anti-Christian bias. And in the tradition of a lot of the stuff that we've seen passed by the Trump administration or in the crazy executive orders, what crosses the line is always so vague that anybody can report anybody for anything, and nobody knows where that line actually is. So if there was something legitimate, they wouldn't know whether or not they were crossing the line or not, or if the line, before they even started, was already half a mile behind them. And just by existing in the space, they've already crossed the line that's violated something that Trump doesn't want to have happen anymore.
Well, I mean, he doesn't
effect.
have a clue what anti-Christian bias is or Christian persecution is. But a lot of Americans don't. If you haven't interfaced with a Christian nationalist or had any kind of conversation with them or interaction with them, you really don't understand the degree of their persecution complex and how they take everything as a slight.
Well, the example you gave in your piece that I thought was really valuable, because a lot of people have had this experience of someone coming or usually a group of people coming and knocking on your door and offering to save you and save you from eternal damnation by having you, accept Jesus as, the whole spiel. And some people are receptive to having those conversations. Others of us have our own belief systems, or we're in the middle of dinner, or we're on a phone call, or have a sick relative and we're rushing out of the house. And none of those reasons matter, because you're going to continue to get the pitch, whether you like it or not. And, saying I'm a practicing whatever, I have a very strong core set of doesn't matter. And when you finally get to the point where you have tried to be polite in 6 different ways and thank them for being there and, encourage them to carry on with whatever it is they feel is right, they're not going to leave, and you are forced into being rude. And when you close the door in their face, you have now taken part in anti-Christian bias.
Exactly. You're the asshole, even though they have been rude. They have not recognized multiple attempts for you to say, I'm sorry, I can't be here. They don't see boundaries. They don't respect boundaries. They just keep pushing. They're assholes, but they always walk away and turn you into the asshole for slamming the door in their faces. So that is an example of anti-Christian bias. Another one that I put in my story yesterday was I'll do two. Suppose that you have a Christian nationalist in your workplace, and every time they come to work, they've got a purse full of gospel tracts, and they put them all over everybody's desk. They shove them in your hands. They put them in the break room. They put them on the toilet paper holders in the bathroom. They just put them everywhere. And it doesn't matter how many times coworkers and supervisors ask them to stop, they don't stop. So they get reprimanded for
Anti-Christian
forcing.
bias.
That's anti-Christian bias according to a Christian nationalist. It would be according to Pam Bondi. It would be according to Marco Rubio. Absolutely would be according to Russ Vought. And the other one that I put in that Hemant Mehta, the friendly atheist, wrote about a couple of years ago was a Southwest case that was actually tried where Southwest fired a flight attendant because she was harassing her coworkers. She was a Christian nationalist who was calling people who went to the Women's March horrible baby killers and sending them harassing emails and getting in people's faces at work and being horrible, calling people names. And she was asked multiple times to stop, and she didn't, so she was terminated. So a judge actually ruled, and I didn't go back and see what ultimately happened with that Southwest had to offer Christian, religious sensitivity training, you know, for the other employees to understand why her being an asshole at work should be okay, because Christians ought to be able to talk about their faith at work without feeling persecuted. And so that's a really good example of what I mean by this. They are aggressive. They don't recognize boundaries. They don't take a hint that you don't want to hear about this. If you tell them, no, I don't want to hear about this, that's anti-Christian bias. If you say, well, I have a different belief system, let me tell you about my different belief system, that's anti-Christian bias. If you say, you know what, I don't believe in an imaginary old man in the sky, and this is all fake and pretend, and you can believe fairy tales if you want, but I don't. That's anti-Christian bias. If you ask them why they don't care about the downtrodden or the poor or the disadvantaged, because Jesus did, they'll push back and say that's anti-Christian bias. I mean, everything that you say to confront them is anti-Christian bias to them.
So everything short of listening for as long as someone wants to speak with you
and agreeing with them
and agreeing is
and
so
agree.
so no one is safe. No one is safe of any religious faith, and I think that's an important point for us to make here, is that this is not going after anti-religious bias. This
No.
is anti-Christian bias, which, we do have a First Amendment. We have the Establishment Clause that, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. But
could not be clearer.
Yeah, could not be clearer. First Amendment. So, all of this, we were founded as a Christian nation. That's absolutely not what the founders intended. And if they were trying to do this in good faith, in a constitutional way, then they would be trying to impose religious freedom for everyone and anti-bias for everyone. But I don't see any task forces being created by Pam Bondi to go over anti-Muslim bias, anti-Jewish bias, anti-Buddhist bias. Where's the protection? Anti-atheism bias.
Mm-hmm.
Where's the protection for all the other belief systems? If this is really not unconstitutional.
In their view, there's not any other belief system. So let's talk a little bit about Russ Vought. who I wrote about yesterday. He was one of the grand architects of Project 2025. He worked in version 1.0 of this regime, and he learned a lot about how to use our own constitution to destroy our government. And so a lot of these directives on Christian teachings and Christianity are most likely written directly by him. He is a religious extremist, radicalized, fanatical Christian nationalist. And I showed again, I wrote about him last summer. I begged people to pay attention to this man. You know, I think people like him are so much more important than the president, and that we should be paying so much more attention to people like him because they're smart and they're strategic and they know how to use the system to destroy itself and get what they want. And he's doing that. So there's a video on my Substack yesterday that I put a link up where people can watch how radicalized he is from this undercover video that was done last year by a British group. So they got him to admit all kinds of things. But he is a real problem with this anti-Christian bias because he truly believes that only Christian nationalists like him are true Christians, and only Christian nationalism is the one true faith. So if you disagree with a Christian nationalist as a Christian, then you're just not really a Christian. If you practice some other faith modality, if you're Jewish or Buddhist or pagan or even Unitarian, you are not entitled to religious freedom protections because you're in a cult. They don't believe that those religions are actual religions. Someone like him absolutely does not believe that. And there are plenty of other people right now in the Republican Party and the Republican hierarchy and in this regime that believe likewise. So no one is safe if you're not a Christian nationalist. And even they won't be eventually.
Right. And this goes way beyond attempting to impose one religion or silence other religions, because there's a section of Project 2025, and at this point we can't think of Project 2025, that 900 and some odd page manifesto, as being separate from our current federal government. That what we have is Project 2025 being enacted. And can you talk a little bit about, there's a section in Project 2025 that describes how anybody can still run for office. That's going to be okay. You can have any faith that you want, but once you are in elected office at any level down to dog catcher, you are not beholden to the laws that have been passed. You are beholden to carry out biblical law in the interpretation of Christian nationalists. And you are not able to do, even if something that you are required to do through that biblical law is completely out of sync with your deeply held religious beliefs, you, Muslim in office, Buddhist in office, whatever the religion might be, you are required to carry out Christian nationalist law, disregard the laws on the books. And if you won't do that, then you will be removed from office and replaced with someone who will, even if the voters had voted overwhelmingly to put you in office.
That is what Project 2025 laid out. And that is direct Christian nationalism from whatever strain of it you want to point to. There's the Opus Dei Catholic version that J.D. Vance is the poster hillbilly elegy for. And there's the Dominionist version that's the Pentecostal, people like Lance Wallnau and people like that are the headpieces for that. And then you've got the Baptist, Protestant, Presbyterian. There are a host of Protestants that band together loosely to form that strain of Christian nationalism. That's what I grew up in. So I'm most familiar with that, but they all use similar language. So they all believe, and this is how I was indoctrinated as a child, that the Bible is God's perfect law, and it's all human beings need to function on this planet. God gave us everything we needed to know in the pages of that book. We don't need anything else. And His law is what we should be living by. And I've actually linked to interviews of white dudes saying that. I'm not just some harpy who's being hysterical. And, you can go on the internet on my Substack and find a link to white dudes actually saying that we need to apply Old Testament biblical punishments for violations of biblical laws. So we should actually stone people to death in public for doing something like committing adultery. And they'll say that's how we should be living. So there are people in this movement who are that extreme and would go that far with it.
But the people who are really responsible for men committing adultery are women. So
of course they are, because women are temptresses, and men can't help it when they lust. They're men, and Adam was tempted by Eve, and it's all her fault. We're all where we are. So women have to pay for all time and be responsible for every terrible thing a man does because he can't control himself. I was indoctrinated in that too. But, Christian nationalists believe that we should be living by biblical laws. And they believe they have a right to break any law that man writes. This is where a lot of the red states' rights stuff really comes from. They just repackaged it as states' rights. But it's really, we have a right to break any federal law that violates our interpretation of the Bible. So, for example, let's take abortion. The Bible doesn't mention abortion, but they cobbled together this series of verses that claim abortion is murder. They say. Plenty of Christians say that's not in the Bible, but they say it is. They insist it is, so everybody has to live that way. And they pass laws in their states that violate federal law that say abortion is murder, and they're going to prosecute that or go after people who give abortions or whatever they do, have you snitching on your neighbors about it and all of that in Texas and other states. So, that's an example of how they believe we should be applying their interpretation of the Bible. And I want to keep stressing that, because how many versions of the Bible are there? I don't even know how many translations there are, how many different groups read the same verse and interpret it differently, but Christian nationalists also anoint themselves as the expert. Their interpretation is right. If you disagree with them, then you're just wrong, and that's another really great thought terminating behavior that they use, because who can really decide what the verse means? God's not going to come down and say, you're right and you're wrong. That's not what faith is about. So you just end up in this argument with someone who's never going to compromise with you or agree with you. So yeah, that's where we are, and that's what we're stuck with so much of the time in our government right now.
So we're seeing in different areas that there's starting to be pushback. We saw Harvard file suit against the federal government for withholding funds. We had a conversation with David Pepper about that yesterday, and 150 schools sign on to a letter opposing what Trump is doing. We've got 12 attorneys general from around the country, or 12 different states who have filed suit over Trump overstepping his legal right to impose tariffs. So we're seeing pushback in different areas. What wonderful to see Musk having to pull back from his involvement because the Tesla takedown worked, and people should be really, really excited to see that kind of result. What can people do who are working inside the VA or in any part of federal government at this point to push back on these things, because this is a whole new layer of people's jobs being at risk?
Well, one of the things that I would encourage anyone to do if you've seen the Pam Bondi directive, there's an email to report anti-Christian bias in it. I would flood that email with Pam Bondi is anti-Christian because, and Marco Rubio is anti-Christian because, and this administration is anti-Christian because, and
Yes.
I would absolutely inundate that email with reporting members of the regime for their anti-Christian behaviors. Caroline Leavitt is anti-Christian because she lies out of her mouth hole every time she opens it, and lying is a sin according to what I've read in the Bible. So, that is an example of what I would do. One way that I would fight back against this is to just flood the zone with complaining about them and their anti-Christian behavior.
Yep. And we will give that email address. We've pushed it out on social media a couple of times, but we will put that in the notes after this live to make sure everybody has it. At some point, this administration is going to learn giving out a reporting number, giving out a reporting email address, making tickets publicly available for people to reserve for Trump rally. These things are not going to work. And these different hotlines and email addresses have been flooded before, and then they get taken down. So I'm so happy you mentioned that, Andrew, because it's not just effective, but it's really kind of therapeutic and fun. And so I encourage everybody to spend a little time today or over the weekend, writing some emails because they've asked for our input. And, I think it's a patriotic thing to do when your government asks you for information to try to be helpful if you have something to share. So please share away. I think that would be lovely. Andrew, we have to have go ahead.
Go ahead. You go ahead.
I was just going to say, we have to have a whole other conversation about how dangerous for everyone and how it will come down on the heads of white men and young white men who have sort of a sense that maybe this authoritarian thing is a good thing long term. They're not going to fit within the boxes of behavior that ultimately are going to be imposed.
Because it won't matter how white of a man you are if you're not a white Christian nationalist man. I have often compared these Christian nationalists to the Taliban. Muslim people sometimes get offended by that, and I don't mean to offend them. I merely want to strip away the faith modality and point out that Christian nationalists are going in that direction. So let's look at something that happened in Afghanistan recently where men didn't care in Afghanistan when the Taliban came in and basically made women prisoners in their own homes. And they couldn't leave their homes without a male chaperone to go anywhere. Couldn't go to school, couldn't be educated, couldn't work. There was an instance recently of a woman who was 8 months pregnant with 7 other children, went into labor early. Her husband was working out of the country. She didn't have a male chaperone to go to the doctor, go to the hospital in this emergency situation, was stopped 3 times and questioned by the Taliban, and she and her baby died. And so, and there are similar examples like that in red states right now. Not to that extent, but women are dying every day because of abortion bans and because they can't get health care in their state. And Republicans are covering it up. And nobody cares about women. America hates women. I mean, I care about women, and a lot of people here do, but you know what I mean. America just hates women. So one of the things that has happened in Afghanistan, now that they've subsumed women and made women essentially enslaved in their own homes and baby making devices for men, now they've started cracking down on men. They've started telling the men that they have to dress a certain way at work, that they have to wear their beards a certain way. They've started reporting people for not attending mosque. If you miss too many mosques, you get a ticket. And if you miss so many more, you can have criminal charges brought against you. And now some of the men are going, we never thought that this would happen to us. And maybe we should have tried harder when they were doing this to the women instead of just not caring. So, that is a cautionary tale for all the white men here who sit every day, all day long and think, well, I'm okay. And none of this is going to impact me. And I don't have to worry about all this stuff. So I'm not going to pay attention to it, because they will eventually get to you and either force you to parrot Christian nationalism or punish you if you refuse to. And they will ruin your life just like they're ruining other people's lives right now on the front lines of who they're going after.
Yeah. And I suspect we're going to see that pretty quickly with people who get reported for anti-Christian bias, because those will not just be, those won't just be women. Those won't just be people of color. They won't just be non-Christians. So I think all of this is becoming real very quickly. I just hope that some of the groups who haven't felt it intensely yet realize that they need to respond quickly, because there is not. Next week we're 100 days into this administration. We've seen the speed that they are moving at, and our reaction to it has to be swift and intense, and we can't let up. It's just no brakes, all gas.
I do want to reiterate to everyone here too, Project 2025 was a plan for the first 180 days of a new Republican administration. So anyone who says, wow, they're going so fast. No, they're just following a plan.
Yeah.
This is what this plan was designed to do. All the times that I told people, we're not just going to shrug our shoulders if Americans elect these people and go in 2026 and vote them out and go back to the way they were. This is a fundamental, granular change of our government from the ground up. And we will not just undo that by changing who's in Congress. They have planned for this and worked for this for 50 years, and they are implementing it with a speed that the plan was designed to implement it with. And they're doing it ruthlessly and very effectively, in my opinion.
They are, which is, why, again, we're going to give you that email address to be able to share your thoughts with the VA reporter line, and just encourage everyone, be reaching out to your members of Congress, be insisting that there be town halls held in your district. If your representative will not hold a town hall, then hold one without them and have somebody come in who will actually answer the questions. David Pepper did a great example on his Substack of how you do that. Show up for a protest, talk to your friends. There just is not, there's not an hour to waste on this. You can take an hour off, because we all have to do that for our mental health here and there. But we can't be sitting on the sidelines. Everybody's got to be involved, pushing back all the time. And we're seeing that it can work. We just have to keep it up. So
yeah, I mean, last time we talked, we mentioned fivecalls.org. That is a great tool to use to contact your representatives. It makes it so easy to contact them, and you can talk about something different every day. There are 10 new outrages every day. You can pick one or two and call them, and they need to keep hearing from people. I also love the town halls where they fed Republican representatives and their talking points into AI, and then had AI answer the questions based on everything these people have said publicly. I think that is amazing. And that's another really good idea. Or you could put a rubber chicken in the chair with their name on it and talk to the rubber chicken or whatever, but just something. The town halls are really important. The protests are really important. We need to keep growing those, seeing more people turn up at those, so that we can get to a quantity that could really be a tipping point for this movement and this resistance.
Yep. And it is possible. And Andra, thank you for all of your contributions to this and for coming in and talking with us regularly. You have so much important information that I hope people will share. Subscribe to, for a time such as this, Andra's newsletter on Substack. tune into her noon conversation on narcissism today. And Andra, I hope you're back here really soon. We're never going to run out of things, or someday I hope to God we run out of things to talk about, and we'll switch subjects
I'd
and
love
talk
to
about.
talk to you about the Princess Bride or something else.
Yes. Someday we're going to talk about for an entire hour nothing but the Princess Bride. But until then, we're on Christian nationalism. We're going to keep talking about it because we have to, and it's important. So thank you. Thanks everybody for being here.
Thanks, everybody.
Great to see you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.